You're 14 years old, standing barefoot on sun-warmed marble. The gymnasium courtyard stretches around you, all geometric shadows and columns bleached white by the afternoon light. There's a hand on your shoulder, firm, possessive, belonging to a man twice your age. He smells of wine and olive oil. He's talking to your father, something about virtue and education, words that sound noble but make your stomach turn. You understand what's happening. The gifts he brought weren't just gifts. The rooster you accepted yesterday wasn't just a rooster. And now everyone's watching, smiling, congratulating your family, while you stand perfectly still, learning the most important lesson Athens will ever teach you: how to leave your body while remaining inside it. Before we go deeper, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm genuinely fascinated that these buried truths still reach people across continents, across centuries of silence. This was ancient Greece, birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and Western civilization itself. We celebrate their contributions, logic, ethics, the Socratic method, Plato's theory of forms. We build universities around their texts. But there's another tradition they perfected, one that doesn't make it into introductory philosophy courses. They called it paiderastia, the love of boys. They wrapped it in poetry, glazed it onto pottery, and encoded it into their educational system. And when you strip away 2,000 years of academic euphemism and museum politeness, you find something that looks less like mentorship and more like systematic predation. Dressed in philosophy's most beautiful language, the pottery tells the story. Museums try to soften. British Museum, Gallery 22, red figure vase, circa 480 BCE. The label reads, courtship scene. But look at the image. A bearded man reaches toward a boy whose arms hang motionless at his sides. The boy's painted face shows nothing, not pleasure, not consent, just absence. There are hundreds of these vessels scattered across major museums, thousands perhaps, each one depicting the same configuration. Older man, younger boy, a hand extending, a gift offered. Wine, a dead hare, a rooster. The roosters were especially significant. In Athenian culture, a boy who accepted a rooster accepted everything that followed. It was a transaction disguised as a gift, a contract written in symbols because writing the terms explicitly would make the grotesque impossible to ignore. Modern curators walk past these vases quickly, using words like complex social customs and mentorship practices. They remind visitors not to impose contemporary moral standards on ancient cultures, and their right context matters. But context cuts both ways, because the Greeks themselves had a word for what happened when a male was penetrated by another male. Hubris, the ultimate degradation, the annihilation of personhood and social standing. Which means every single one of these boys knew, even as philosophers praised the nobility of their relationship, that they were being destroyed according to their own culture's deepest values. Starred in Thebes, the sacred band. They called it 150 pairs of male lovers, the most elite fighting force in ancient Greece. Modern historians celebrate them as evidence that Greek same-sex relationships were honorable, even heroic. But examine how these pairs formed. Plutarch, writing centuries later, described the process with uncomfortable clarity. Older warriors selected younger boys, teenagers, really from prominent families. The selection was public, ritualized. The boy had no meaningful choice. His family's honor, his city's military strength, his own future citizenship all depended on his submission to this sacred bond. They called the older man the erasists, the lover. They called the boy the eromenos, he beloved beautiful words for an ugly transaction. The erasists was expected to desire, to pursue, to hunger. That was his role as a mature man. The eromenos was expected to submit, but, and this is crucial, not to desire back, not to enjoy it. His role was endurance, acceptance. The Greeks had a specific term for a boy who showed enthusiasm, katapougon, apathic, a creature of shame. Picture the psychological trap. You're 14, a respected warrior, friend of your father, hero of your city selects you. Everyone congratulates your family. You're told this will make you a man, teach you virtue, prepare you for citizenship. But you also know that what's about to happen, penetration is the single most shameful act your culture can conceive of. If you resist, you dishonor your family. If you submit, you're destroyed. And if you dare show any physical response, pleasure, desire, even involuntary arousal, you become something unspeakable. So you learn to stand perfectly still. You learn to make your face blank, You learn to go somewhere else while your body stays behind. You become the boy in the vase, painting frozen, waiting for it to end. The sacred band died at Kyrenia in 338 BCE, cut down by Philip of Macedon's forces. Philip allegedly wept when he saw their bodies. Lovers fallen beside lovers, perish any man who suspects these men of doing or suffering anything unseemly, he declared. But the boys who survived Theban pederasty never got memorials, never got tears from kings. They just got older, and then they selected boys of their own, and the cycle continued. Plato sits at the center of this story like a spider in a web of beautiful words. We call it platonic love, now pure, spiritual, transcendent. When we describe a relationship as platonic, we mean it's innocent, free from sexual desire. But that's not what Plato meant, not even close. In the Symposium, Plato's characters spend an entire evening discussing passionate, consuming desire specifically for adolescent boys. Alcibiades, young and beautiful, describes how Socrates desired him, pursued him, struggled with self-control in his presence. Socrates, in Plato's telling, is obsessed with beautiful youths. His students joke about it. It's played for comedy. But then Plato performs an extraordinary philosophical sleight of hand. He takes this desire, this hunger for teenage boys, and transforms it into philosophy's highest aspiration. The lover begins with attraction to a beautiful body, yes, but through philosophy, he ascends from physical beauty to beautiful souls, from individual beauty to beauty itself, from the flesh of a boy to the eternal forms. It's brilliant, really. A justification so elegant that 2,000 years of Western philosophers would repeat it without examining what it excused. Because here's what Plato's doing. He's not condemning the desire. He's not protecting the boys. He's creating a framework where lusting after adolescence becomes the first rung on the ladder to enlightenment. The boy's experience, his pain, his shame, his trauma, never enters the equation. He exists as a stepping stone, a beautiful object that leads the philosopher upward toward truth. In the Phaedrus, Plato describes the ideal lover's self-control. The truly virtuous man, he argues, desires the boy intensely, but restrains himself mostly. Perhaps some kissing, some touching, but he stops short of penetration, preserving the boy's honor while still indulging his own noble passion. This was the progressive position in ancient Athens. The enlightened view wasn't, don't sexually pursue children. It was pursue them, but show restraint. And even this restrained version, Plato admits, was rare. Most erasti lacked such self-control. But that's a failure of the individual, not the system. The system itself, older men desiring and pursuing boys, that's natural, beautiful, the foundation of education. Xenophon, Socrates' other great chronicler, tried to clean this up further. In his version, Socrates condemns physical relationships entirely. True pederasty should be purely spiritual, a love of the boy's soul, not his body. But even Xenophon can't escape the contradiction. If it's truly about the soul, why do these lovers always select beautiful boys? Why does the pursuit always begin with physical attraction? Why are ugly boys left un... The answer was obvious then, and remains obvious now. The philosophy was a justification grafted onto desire. The beauty of souls was a story told to excuse the pursuit of bodies. Not every philosopher agreed. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, savaged pederasty in play after play. His jokes landed because his audience recognized the truth in them that the lofty rhetoric barely concealed predation, that old men sniffing around gymnasiums were pathetic, that boys knew exactly what these philosophers really wanted. The fact that Athenian audiences laughed tells us something crucial. Ordinary people knew this was grotesque. The philosophical justifications didn't convince everyone, but they convinced the people with power. Crete took it further, made it formal, made it law. The ritual was called harpage, the abduction. A man would select a boy, usually between 12 and 15. He'd notify the boy's family of his intentions, a formality. Since refusal brought shame, then gather his friends for the kidnapping. They'd chase the boy through the streets, capture him, carry him away to the countryside for 2 months. 2 months alone, hunting, feasting, and whatever else happened in those isolated shepherds' huts, while the city waited. When they returned, the man would present gifts, a military uniform, an ox, a drinking cup. The ox was sacrificed, the meat shared with the boy's age mates, and the boy would declare publicly whether the abductor had treated him properly. Scholars debate what properly meant. What a boy could safely say after 2 months alone with a grown man who'd legally kidnapped him. Whether any boy ever said no in that public square, knowing his entire future depended on this man's reputation? The drinking cup was especially significant. The boy was required to use it at all public functions, for the rest of his life a permanent mark of whose beloved he had been. Whose property? We call this institutionalized paiderasty. We trace its origins to warrior cultures that valued male bonding, but strip away the anthropological jargon. This was a legal system where grown men could abduct children, take them into isolation for months, and return with those children marked permanently as theirs. And this was the proper way, the honorable way, the way that preserved social standing. What happened to boys who didn't fit the ideal, the ones who couldn't maintain the fiction of noble mentorship? They became pornoi prostitutes. The word literally means bought ones. Athens was full of them. Boys from poor families who couldn't afford the luxury of proper pederastic education. Boys who'd been enslaved. Boys who, for whatever reason, had already lost their honor and had nothing left to lose. These boys stood in brothels, on street corners, sometimes in their own homes, available for any man with coin. And Athenian men used them casually, the same way they used female prostitutes or slaves. The distinction was crucial. A citizen boy in a proper pederastic relationship with a respectable erased maintained his honor barely, precariously, but maintained it. A pornos had no honor to maintain. He could be used by anyone, penetrated by anyone, and because he'd accepted money, he'd forfeited his path to citizenship. He could never vote, never speak in assembly, never fully be a man. This wasn't moral judgment against prostitution. Athens had no problem with prostitution. It was everywhere, regulated, taxed. The judgment was against the boy for allowing himself to be penetrated for money, for making his shame visible and commercial. A citizen boy who submitted to his erased in private was being educated. A poor boy who submitted to strangers for coins was being destroyed permanently. Legally, socially, the same act. The only difference was whether your father could afford to package it as philosophy. The academy, Plato's school, birthplace of Western philosophy, passed from lover to beloved for a century. That single fact should disturb us more than it does. After Plato died, leadership went to Speusippus, his nephew. But the real tradition was this. The head of the academy would take a younger male lover, train him in philosophy, and eventually pass leadership to him. Polymon succeeded Crates, his former erased. Crates succeeded Xenocrates, on and on. Philosophy's greatest institution operated like a hereditary system where the price of leadership was submission to your predecessor. Imagine being a brilliant young man with philosophical aspirations. You want to study with the greatest minds, maybe lead the academy someday. But advancement requires attracting the attention of the current head, accepting his mentorship, becoming his eromenos. Your mind might be brilliant, your ideas revolutionary, but first you have to endure his touch. And if you refuse, there are other brilliant young men, other hungry students willing to pay the price. This wasn't an aberration. This was philosophy's most prestigious institution, running on sexual coercion for 100 years. The archaeological record refuses to cooperate with sanitized narratives. Beneath ancient gymnasiums in Athens, archaeologists found graffiti, crude, angry, the kind of messages boys scratch when no one's watching. Timaios is a katepu gun. Kleonikos sells himself. Names, accusations, the permanent record of social destruction. These weren't written by poets or philosophers. They were written by other boys, maybe victims, lashing out, maybe witnesses naming what they'd seen, maybe the boys themselves carving their shame into stone because they had nowhere else to put it. In museum storage rooms, there are vessels that never get displayed, the ones too explicit, too clearly showing violence rather than courtship. Curators call them problematic. They keep them in back rooms where researchers must request them specifically. The photographs show what the public galleries won't: a boy's face contorted, an older man restraining him. The artist captured something raw and true, and museums decided we didn't need to see it. But those vases exist. That graffiti exists. The stones remember what the poets tried to forget. Scholar Enid Brock spent years studying courtship vases, noticing something that made curators uncomfortable. The boys' postures, their body language, the way their arms hang, the blankness of their painted faces. Psychologically immobilized, she called it, not consent, dissociation. One vase shows a boy staring straight ahead while a man's hand reaches between his legs. The boy's hands are at his sides, his face is empty. Another shows a boy receiving gifts, the rooster, the hare, while his body language screams discomfort. But he accepts them anyway, because accepting meant maybe it would be gentle, maybe it wouldn't hurt as much. Refusing meant dishonor, family shame, maybe violence. We don't talk about the boy's face when we teach these images. We discuss pottery techniques, glaze composition, the historical context of gymnasium culture. But we don't talk about the absence in his eyes, the way his body learned to go somewhere else while men discussed his future. By the Roman period, something shifted, not entirely, not cleanly, but Roman writers began looking back at Greek paiderasty with discomfort, even disgust. Cicero called it the Greek vice. Roman moralists argued it feminized boys, made them weak. The Romans preferred their exploitation more straightforward slaves, prostitutes, conquered peoples. They had no patience for philosophical justifications. Christianity finished what Roman pragmatism started. Early church fathers condemned pederasty explicitly, not just the physical acts, but the entire philosophical framework justifying them. Augustine, who'd studied Greek philosophy before converting, was particularly harsh. He understood the arguments, he'd read Plato, and he called it what it was: predation dressed in beautiful language. By the medieval period, Platonic love had been completely rewritten. Medieval Christians kept Plato's ladder ascending from physical to spiritual, but removed the boy entirely, made it about transcending earthly desire altogether. That's the Platonic love we inherited, the sanitized version, the lie that erased what Plato actually meant. But the vases don't lie, and if you look closely at the history of Western philosophy, you can still see the stains beneath all that marble. This isn't just ancient history. The pattern Greek philosophers established respected intellectuals, justifying sexual access to adolescence through elaborate frameworks about mentorship, and education has repeated throughout history. Medieval monasteries, Renaissance art studios, Enlightenment salons, boarding schools across Europe and America. Every generation finds new language for the same transaction: mentorship, patronage, special attention. Grooming, we call it now, when we're being honest. The Greek philosophers gave predators a gift that has lasted 2 millennia, a philosophical framework that makes exploitation look like enlightenment. When a teacher today pursues a student and calls it mentorship, he's speaking Plato's language. When institutions protect abusers because they're brilliant or important, they're operating like the academy. When we tell victims they should feel honored by the attention, grateful for the education they're receiving, we're repeating what the Erastai told the Eremenoi. The names change, the language evolves, but the boy, standing still, arms at his sides, learning to leave his body while adults discuss his future. That boy is eternal. Return to that vase in the British Museum. Gallery 22, red figure pottery, circa 480 BCE. The courtship scene. But see it differently now. Don't see courtship, see documentation. This vase is evidence, a confession glazed in ceramic. The artist captured what poets couldn't say and philosophers wouldn't admit. That boy's face blank, frozen, absent, is the most honest thing ancient Greece left us. The philosophers gave us transcendent theories about love and education and the ascent toward truth. But the vase painter gave us truth itself, the kind that doesn't soar toward eternal forms, the kind that stays locked in a body that learned to leave itself behind. Greek philosophy built Western civilization. It gave us logic, ethics, political theory, metaphysics. It taught us how to think, but it built that legacy on the bodies of children who had to stop thinking, stop feeling, just to survive. That's not in the textbooks, not in college courses on ancient philosophy, not in the inspirational Plato quotes we share online. But it's in the vases, in the graffiti, in the silence between their beautiful words. The boy in the vase is still standing there, still frozen, still waiting for someone to see him. Not as art, but as a witness. We just let him testify. The question is whether we're finally ready to listen.